The ballroom glittered with false elegance, chandeliers casting golden light over men in tailored suits and women draped in silk and diamonds. Julia stood near the edge of the crowd, her dark skin gleaming under the warm glow, her posture rigid despite the flowing emerald dress she'd been told to wear. She didn't belong here. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but the two men stationed near the exits made it clear that wasn't an option. She'd been brought here 3 days ago, pulled into something she still didn't fully understand. Her brother Marcus had made a mistake, a terrible one, involving money that didn't belong to him and people who didn't forgive debts. Julia had tried to warn him, tried to pull him back from the edge, but by the time she understood how deep he'd fallen, it was too late. They'd come for him in the middle of the night, and when they couldn't find him, they'd taken her instead. Collateral, they called it. Insurance. The man who held her fate in his hands stood across the room, surrounded by others who spoke to him with deference that bordered on fear. Gabriele Marino. She'd heard the name whispered with reverence and terror in equal measure. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never had to ask for anything twice, his presence commanding attention without effort. Julia had learned quickly that in this world, silence was survival. She'd watched, listened, kept her head down. The estate where they'd brought her was more fortress than home, all high walls and watchful eyes. She'd been given a room, told to stay there unless summoned, and left to wonder what would happen when her brother's debt came due and she was all they had to collect. Tonight was different. Tonight, she'd been dressed up, brought out, displayed. She didn't know why, only that refusing hadn't been an option. A man approached her, his smile too wide, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. He was older, with graying hair and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He spoke to her in Italian first, then switched to accented English when she didn't respond. "You are new here, yes," he said, stepping closer than necessary. "I have not seen you before. You are very beautiful." Julia took a small step back, her voice steady despite the flutter of panic in her chest. "Thank you, but I'd prefer to be left alone." His smile didn't waver. "Come now, don't be shy. A woman like you, at a party like this, you must know how to enjoy yourself." He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around her wrist before she could pull away. "Dance with me." I said no. She tried to twist free, but his grip tightened, his smile turning sharp. "In this house, beautiful things don't say no to me." He pulled her toward the dance floor, his other hand moving to her waist. Julia's heart hammered. She planted her feet, tried to wrench herself free, but he was stronger, and the men nearby were watching with amusement rather than concern. She opened her mouth to protest louder, to make a scene if she had to, when a voice cut through the music and conversation like a blade. "Let her go." The room didn't fall silent, not entirely, but there was a shift, a ripple of awareness that spread outward from where Gabriele Marino stood. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved from his position near the bar, but every person in the ballroom felt the weight of those 3 words. The man holding Julia hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. "Gabrielle, I was just... I don't care what you were doing." Gabrielle's tone was flat, devoid of emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying. "I told you to let her go. Are you having trouble understanding me?" The man released Julia immediately, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of appeasement. Of course. I meant no disrespect." Gabrielle finally looked at him, and Julia saw something flicker in his expression, something cold and final. "Leave the party. Leave the estate. Now. And don't come back unless I send for you, which I won't." The man's face went pale. He glanced around as if looking for support, but found none. With a stiff nod, he turned and walked toward the exit, his humiliation complete. Julia stood frozen, her wrist still tingling from where she'd been grabbed. Gabrielle's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, she couldn't read what she saw there. It wasn't kindness, exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something more complicated, something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. He walked toward her, the crowd parting without being asked. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the slight imperfection in the bridge of his nose that suggested it had been broken once, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Good." He glanced at the room, at the people who were trying not to stare while obviously listening. "This party is over. Everyone out." There was a moment of stunned silence, then movement. People began gathering their things, offering hasty goodbyes, filing toward the exits with the kind of orderly efficiency that came from knowing better than to argue. Within minutes, the ballroom was empty except for Julia, Gabrielle, and the staff who moved through quietly, beginning to clean up. Julia didn't know what to do. She stood there, feeling exposed in the sudden quiet, aware of how alone she was with this man who held her life in his hands. Gabrielle gestured toward a side door. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. She followed, her heels clicking against the marble floor as they walked through corridors she hadn't seen before, past paintings that probably cost more than her childhood home, until they reached a room that was clearly his office. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, held one out to her. When she hesitated, he set it on the desk within her reach. "You don't have to drink it. But you might want to." She took the glass, more to have something to do with her hands than out of any real desire. The silence stretched between them, not comfortable but not entirely hostile either. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what you did back there." Gabrielle leaned against the desk, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "You shouldn't have been in that situation to begin with. That's on me. I shouldn't be here at all." "No," he agreed quietly. "You shouldn't." The admission surprised her. She'd expected deflection, justification, the kind of rationalization that people in his position probably use to sleep at night. Instead, he was looking at her like he saw her as a person rather than a problem to be solved or a tool to be used. "Your brother," he said, and her stomach dropped. "He still hasn't surfaced. We've been looking, but he's either very good at hiding or very far away." "He's scared," Julia said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "He made a mistake, a stupid one, but he's not a bad person. He just got in over his head. People die from mistakes like his." The bluntness of it stole her breath. "I know. I tried to stop him. I tried so many times, but he wouldn't listen, and now," she cut herself off, hating the tremor in her voice. "What are you going to do with me?" Gabrielle was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet." At least he was honest. Julia took a sip of the drink, the burn of it grounding her. "The man tonight, the one who grabbed me. He said he'd never seen me before. Why was I brought out for the party? Because I wanted to see how you'd handle yourself in that environment. And you did better than I expected." He set his glass down, crossed his arms. "Most people in your position would have tried to blend in, to play along, to make themselves useful or agreeable. You didn't do any of that. You stood your ground, even when it would have been easier not to. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's an observation." Julia shook her head, suddenly tired of the careful dance of words. "What do you want from me, Gabrielle?" The use of his first name seemed to catch him off guard. His expression shifted, something almost like surprise crossing his features before settling back into that careful neutrality he wore like armor. "Right now? I want you to go back to your room, get some rest, and not do anything stupid like trying to run. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was all she was going to get. Julia set down her glass and turned toward the door, then paused. "That man you threw out tonight. Will you?" She stopped, not sure how to ask the question. "Will I what? Hurt him? Kill him?" Gabrielle's voice was matter-of-fact. "No. He's an idiot and a liability, but he's not worth the trouble. He'll spread the word about what happened, and others will learn from it. That's punishment enough. She nodded, something in her chest loosening slightly, and left without another word. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. Julia was no longer confined to her room, though she was always aware of the men who watched from a distance, ensuring she didn't stray too far. She was allowed to eat in the main dining room, to walk through the gardens, to use the library that took up an entire wing of the estate. And she kept running into Gabrielle. It started to feel less like coincidence and more like intention. He'd appear in the library while she was reading, settle into a chair across from her without speaking, working through papers with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. Or she'd find him in the garden at dawn, standing by the fountain with a cup of coffee, and he'd acknowledge her with a slight nod before returning his attention to whatever thoughts occupied him. They began to talk, small exchanges at first. He asked what she was reading. She asked if the gardens had always been so meticulously maintained. Neutral topics, safe ground. But slowly, inevitably, the conversations deepened. One evening, as rain pelted the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, Julia found herself in the library again. Gabrielle was there, as he often was, but tonight he seemed different. Restless. He stood by the window, watching the storm, and when she entered, he didn't pretend not to notice. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He turned to look at her. "This life? Any of it? The estate, the responsibilities, the constant weight of everyone looking to you for answers." Gabrielle was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Every day." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. "But you don't," Julia pressed. "No. Because leaving would mean abandoning people who depend on me. It would mean creating a power vacuum that would get filled by someone worse. And it would mean accepting that everything I've sacrificed, everything I've become, was for nothing." Julia moved closer, drawn by something in his voice, a weariness that spoke to her own exhaustion. "What did you sacrifice?" "The luxury of being a good man." He said it without self-pity, just stating a fact. "I was 19 when my father died. He left me this empire and the choice to either hold it together or watch it tear itself apart and take innocent people with it. So I learned to make hard decisions. I learned to be feared more than loved. I learned to carry weight that would crush most people, and I did it because the alternative was worse. That doesn't make you a bad person. Doesn't it?" His smile was bitter. "The things I've done, Julia, the choices I've made to keep power consolidated, to prevent wars, to maintain order. You think those were good?" "I think they were impossible," she said quietly. "I think you were a kid who was given a role no one should have to fill, and you did what you thought you had to do to survive it." He looked at her like she'd said something incomprehensible, like the concept of being seen with compassion rather than judgment was foreign to him. "Maybe it was. Why are you here?" The question came out rougher than he probably intended. "In this room, right now, talking to me like I'm a person instead of a monster you're trapped with." Julia considered the question honestly. "Because you've never lied to me. Because when I look at you, I don't see a monster. I see someone who's tired and lonely and doing his best with impossible circumstances." She took a breath. "And maybe because I'm tired and lonely too, and it's easier to be that way with someone who understands than to pretend everything's fine when we both know it isn't." Something shifted in the space between them, a recognition of shared burden. Gabrielle moved away from the window, coming to stand in front of her. Close enough that she could see the storm reflected in his eyes, close enough that the air felt charged with more than just electricity from the thunder outside. "You should hate me," he said softly. "I'm the reason you're here. The reason your life has been turned upside down." "I know." She didn't look away. "But hate takes energy, and I'd rather save mine for figuring out how to survive this." His hand came up, hovering near her face like he wanted to touch her but didn't quite dare. "If I could change how this started, I would. But you can't." "No." The honest was brutal and gentle all at once. Julia found herself leaning into that almost touch, and then his palm was against her cheek, warm and solid and real. The moment stretched, fragile and heavy, both of them aware they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Gabrielle's thumb traced along her cheekbone, and Julia's eyes fluttered closed. She heard him take a shaky breath, felt him lean closer, and then his forehead was resting against hers, and they were just breathing together in the quiet library while the storm raged outside. "This is dangerous," he whispered. "I know. I can't promise you anything good will come from this. I'm not asking you to." And then he was kissing her, soft and careful, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Julia kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer even as a voice in her head screamed that this was foolish, that she was courting disaster, that nothing good could come from feeling this way about a man who lived the life he did. But in that moment, with thunder shaking the windows and his arms around her, she couldn't bring herself to care. The days that followed were careful. They didn't speak about what had happened in the library, didn't acknowledge the shift between them in any overt way. But Julia felt it in every interaction. The way Gabrielle's hand would linger when he passed her something. The way his eyes would find her across a room. The way conversations that started about books or weather would drift into deeper waters, touching on dreams they'd given up and fears they'd never voiced. She learned about the pressure he carried, the constant negotiations between families, the delicate balance of power that required him to be ruthless when he wanted to be merciful, cold when he wanted to be warm. She learned about the nephew he'd raised after his sister died, the boy he'd tried to keep separate from this life but who'd been marked by it anyway. She learned about the mornings he woke up wondering if this would be the day someone decided he was more valuable dead than alive. And she told him things too. About growing up with Marcus, just the two of them after their parents died. About the scholarships she'd earned, the teaching position she'd accepted at an elementary school, the small apartment she'd made into a home. About the future she'd been building, piece by careful piece, that had been shattered the night they'd come for her. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. 3 weeks into her captivity, Julia woke to shouting. She grabbed a robe and rushed into the hallway, finding controlled chaos. Men moving with purpose, weapons being checked, Gabrielle in the center of it all issuing orders in rapid Italian. He saw her and his expression hardened. "Get back in your room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "What's happening?" "Now, Julia." The command in his voice left no room for argument. She retreated, locked the door, and sat on her bed with her heart hammering. Minutes stretched into hours. She heard cars leaving, the estate growing quieter, the silence more oppressive than the noise had been. When the knock finally came, gentle against the wood, she almost didn't answer. But then Gabrielle's voice, tired and strained, "It's me. Open up." She unlocked the door to find him looking more worn than she'd ever seen him. There was blood on his shirt, not his own from the way he was moving, and his hands were shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. Julia pulled him inside, closed the door. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." He sank onto the edge of her bed like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "There was a situation. Someone thought they could make a move while I was distracted. They were wrong." "Distracted by what?" He looked up at her, and the raw emotion in his face made her breath catch. "By you. By the fact that I care more about what happens to you than I've cared about anything in years, and that makes me vulnerable in ways I can't afford." Julia knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. They were cold despite the warmth of the room. "Is it over?" "For now. But it won't be the last time. This is what my life is, Julia. This constant state of waiting for the next crisis, the next betrayal, the next fight. And the more I care about you, the more danger you're in, because people will see that and use it against me. Then send me away." The words hurt to say, but she forced them out. "If I'm a liability, if keeping me here puts you at risk, then let me go." Gabrielle's laugh was hollow. "I can't. And not because of your brother's debt or because you're useful leverage. I can't let you go because the thought of you walking out of this estate and me never seeing you again is unbearable, and that terrifies me more than any threat from my enemies. Julia cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. I'm scared too. I'm scared of what I feel for you, scared of what it means, scared of where this is going. But I'm here, and I'm not running, and maybe that's enough for right now. He kissed her then, desperate and hungry, all the careful control he usually maintained crumbling. Julia kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his. It felt like drowning and breathing for the first time all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this. How to be what I am and also be with you in any way that isn't destructive. Then we figure it out together. And if we can't? Julia didn't have an answer for that. So instead, she just held him, and let him hold her, and tried not to think about how precarious their foundation was. The next morning brought news that made Gabrielle's expression shutter closed. Marcus had been found. He was alive, hiding in a city 3 hours away, and Gabrielle's men had him in custody. Julia felt her world tilt. I want to see him. That's not a good idea. I don't care if it's a good idea. He's my brother. I want to see him. They stared at each other, wills clashing. Finally, Gabrielle nodded. Fine. But there are conditions. You don't tell him anything about what's happened between us. You don't make promises about what I will or won't do. And you accept that after you see him, decisions will have to be made. The warehouse where they'd taken Marcus was exactly the kind of place Julia had been trying not to imagine. Cold concrete, harsh lighting, the smell of oil and rust. Her brother sat in a metal chair, his hands zip-tied in front of him, looking thin and exhausted and terrified. When he saw her, his face crumpled. Jules, God, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to get pulled into this. I never meant. Shut up, Marcus. Her voice was harder than she'd intended, but seeing him, knowing what his choices had cost her, made anger flare hot in her chest. Just shut up. He flinched. Gabrielle stood a few feet away, giving them space but clearly listening to every word. Julia crouched down so she was eye level with her brother. Why? Why would you be so stupid? I told you to stay away from those people. I begged you. I thought I could make it work, Marcus said miserably. I thought I could pay them back before it became a problem. But it spiraled, and I panicked, and by the time I realized how bad it was, they were already looking for me. So you ran and left me to deal with the consequences. I didn't know they'd take you. I swear, Jules, I didn't know. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to think her brother wouldn't have abandoned her knowingly. But the truth was more complicated than that. He'd made choices without thinking about the fallout, and she'd paid the price. They both had. What happens now? Marcus looked past her to Gabrielle. Are you going to kill me? Gabrielle's expression was unreadable. That depends on several factors. I can get the money. I just need time. You've had time. You've had chances. What you need is consequences that make an impression. Julia stood, turned to face Gabrielle. Can I talk to you? Alone? He gestured toward a corner of the warehouse. They walked far enough that Marcus couldn't hear them, but close enough that he could see them. Please, Julia said quietly. I know he screwed up. I know he deserves punishment for what he's done. But he's all the family I have left. If you kill him, you'll be killing a piece of me too. Gabrielle's jaw tightened. And if I let him walk away with no real consequences, I show weakness. I show that debts can be avoided if you just hide long enough. Do you understand what that would do? The message it would send? Then make an example another way. Make him work off the debt. Make him prove he's learned something. But please, don't take his life. I'm begging you. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. The man who cared about her, warring with the boss who couldn't afford to be seen as soft. Finally, he said, he works for me. Directly. For as long as it takes to pay back what he owes, plus interest. He does exactly what he's told, when he's told, no questions. One mistake, one sign that he's not taking this seriously, and the offer is off the table. Those are the terms. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't freedom. But it was life, and right now, that was enough. Julia nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're vouching for him, which means if he fails, that reflects on you too. You understand that? She did. And the weight of it settled on her shoulders like a physical thing. When she told Marcus the terms, she saw relief and resentment war on his face. He wanted to argue, she could see it, wanted to negotiate or complain. But something in her expression must have warned him that this was the only offer he'd get, because he swallowed whatever protests he'd been forming and nodded. Okay. Okay, I'll do it. Whatever you need. Gabrielle made arrangements for Marcus to be housed on the estate, in the staff quarters where he could be monitored. Julia watched her brother being led away, and felt the full weight of what she'd done crash over her. She'd tied him to this life more securely than any debt could have, and in doing so, she'd tied herself more firmly too. That night, she couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls of the estate until she found herself outside Gabrielle's private quarters. She knocked before she could talk herself out of it. He answered wearing sleep pants and nothing else, his hair mussed, eyes alert despite the late hour. Julia. What's wrong? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He stepped aside, letting her in. The room was more personal than she'd expected, with photographs on the dresser and books stacked on the nightstand. Evidence of a life beyond the role he played. Ask. Did you spare Marcus because you care about me, or because you saw an opportunity to keep me here? Gabrielle didn't answer immediately. He sat on the edge of his bed, and Julia remained standing, needing the distance. Both, he said finally. I won't lie to you. Yes, I care about you, and seeing you hurt would hurt me. But I also recognize that your brother alive and in debt to me gives you a reason to stay that doesn't involve force. That makes you a willing participant instead of a captive. So yes, there was calculation in my mercy. The honesty was brutal. It would have been easier if he'd lied, if he'd let her believe it was purely about compassion. But Gabrielle had never given her easy, only real. I hate that you think like that, she said softly. I know. But I also understand why you do. He looked up at her, surprised. Do you? You've had to think 3 moves ahead for so long that it's become instinct. You see people as pieces on a board because that's how you've survived. But Gabrielle, I need you to understand something. She moved closer, standing between his knees. I'm not staying because my brother is here. I'm staying because despite everything, despite all the reasons this is a terrible idea, I want to be here. With you. That's my choice, not something you've manipulated me into. His hands came up to rest on her hips, gentle and grounding. Why? Why would you choose this? Because when I'm with you, I feel like I matter. Not as a teacher or a sister or a hostage, but as me. Because you're honest even when the truth is ugly. Because I see the weight you carry and I want to help shoulder it, even though I know that's probably impossible. She cradled his face in her hands. And because somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you, and I'm done pretending I haven't. The words hung in the air between them, irreversible and terrifying. Gabrielle's eyes closed, and she felt him tremble slightly beneath her touch. I don't deserve that, he whispered. Probably not. I don't deserve to be in this situation either. But here we are. He pulled her down into his lap, his arms wrapping around her like he could keep the world at bay through sheer will. I love you too. God help us both, but I love you too. They held each other in the quiet of his room, 2 people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and chosen connection anyway. The weeks that followed were both easier and harder than before. Easier because they'd stopped pretending, stopped dancing around what was between them. Harder because being together openly meant facing the reality of what that meant in Gabrielle's world. Julia learned the rules quickly. Don't ask about business. Don't repeat conversations overheard. Don't leave the estate without permission and security. Be aware that every interaction was watched, assessed, potentially used as leverage. She also learned that Gabriel, in private, was different from the man he presented to the world. He was gentle with her, thoughtful, present in a way that suggested their time together was a refuge from everything else. He'd tell her about his day in vague terms, and she'd tell him about the books she was reading, the walks through the garden, the slow process of teaching Marcus how to be responsible. Her brother was struggling but trying. She could see it in the way he took orders without complaint, in the careful way he navigated the estate's hierarchy. They didn't talk much, the hurt still too fresh on both sides, but she saw him becoming someone more serious, more aware of consequences. 3 months into her new reality, Julia was in the library when one of Gabrielle's lieutenants, a man named Paolo, entered. He was usually respectful, if distant, but today there was something calculating in his expression that put her on edge. "Miss Julia," he said, his accent thick. "May I speak with you?" "Of course." He sat across from her, his posture casual, but she sensed the tension beneath it. "You have become very important to Gabrielle. This is obvious to everyone. Is there a point to this observation? Only that important people are also valuable. And sometimes, value can be a burden." It took her a moment to understand the veiled threat. "Are you suggesting that being with Gabrielle puts me in danger?" "I am suggesting that in our world, nothing is sacred. Love least of all. There are those who would see your relationship as weakness to be exploited." Julia set down her book, meeting his gaze steadily. "Is this a warning or a threat?" "A warning. For now." He stood, smoothing his jacket. "Gabriel is a good boss. A fair one, when he can afford to be. But he is also a man who has made enemies, and those enemies will not hesitate to hurt what he loves if it serves their purpose. You should remember that." After he left, Julia sat in the quiet library, her heart racing. She'd known, intellectually, that being with Gabrielle came with risks. But having it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. That evening, she told Gabrielle about the conversation. His reaction was swift and cold. "Paolo said this to you directly?" "Yes." He claimed it was a warning, but it felt like more than that. Gabrielle's expression turned to stone. "It was a test. He wanted to see if you'd run to me, how you'd react, whether you could be used to influence my decisions." He pulled out his phone, sent a brief text. "He'll be dealt with." "Gabrielle, what does that mean?" "It means he crossed a line, and there are consequences for that." "Are you going to hurt him?" He looked at her, and she saw the divide between them clearly for the first time in weeks. The part of his life she couldn't follow him into, couldn't understand or condone. "I'm going to make sure he understands that you are off limits. How I do that is not something you need to know. But I want to know. If we're really in this together, I can't just close my eyes to the things you do." "Yes, you can. You have to, Julia, because the alternative is you seeing me for what I really am, and I'm not ready for that." The admission hung between them, stark and painful. Julia stood, closed the distance between them, took his face in her hands. "I already know what you are. I'm not naive enough to think you've built this empire with kindness and good intentions. But I also know that you're trying to be better than you have to be, and that has to count for something. Does it?" His voice was rough. "Or am I just fooling myself that there's any redemption possible for someone who's done the things I've done?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't have those answers. But I know that beating yourself up for choices you can't change doesn't help anyone. What matters is what you do now, going forward." He pulled her close, his face buried in her hair, and she felt the shudder that ran through him. "I don't want you to become collateral damage in my war. Then we'll be careful. We'll be smart. But I'm not leaving unless you tell me to go, and even then, I might not listen." His laugh was strangled, more pain than humor. Stubborn woman. You love it. I do. He pulled back enough to look at her. I really do. 2 days later, Paolo was gone. Julia didn't ask where, didn't inquire about the details. She told herself it was trust, that she was respecting boundaries. But deep down, she knew it was also fear. Fear of what she'd learn, what it would mean for how she saw Gabrielle. But life continued. Marcus proved himself competent, working in logistics coordination, staying clean, staying focused. He and Julia began to rebuild something, not the easy sibling relationship they'd had before, but something more honest and hard-earned. And Julia found a rhythm in her days. She started tutoring some of the staff's children, giving them lessons in reading and math. It wasn't the classroom she'd lost, but it was purpose, and that mattered. Gabrielle watched her teach one afternoon, standing in the doorway unnoticed. When the lesson ended and the children scattered, he approached her. You're good with them. I miss it. Teaching, I mean. Being able to shape young minds, help them see possibilities. You could go back to it. Eventually. If you wanted. Julia looked at him, saw the careful hope in his expression. Would you want me to? I want you to have whatever makes you happy. Even if that means you're not here as much. It was a gift, that offering. Permission to have a life beyond these walls. Julia set down the books she'd been gathering, turned to face him fully. What if what makes me happy is building something here? Not as your prisoner or your kept woman, but as someone who chooses to be part of your life. That's a hell of a choice to make. I know. But I'm making it anyway. He kissed her then, slow and deep, and she tasted promise in it. Uncertain and fragile, but real. 4 months became 6. Summer turned to fall. Julia's birthday came and went, celebrated quietly with a dinner Gabrielle had catered from her favorite restaurant. Marcus earned enough trust to start going on supervised runs, proving he could follow orders and think on his feet. And Julia and Gabrielle built something that looked almost like normalcy. They had dinner together most nights. They'd sit in his office while he worked, her reading while he handled business. They'd walk the gardens in the evening, talking about everything and nothing. But underneath the domestic peace, Julia could feel the pressure building. Gabrielle was tense more often, distracted. Meetings ran longer. Phone calls came at odd hours. Something was shifting in his world, and while he didn't share the details, she felt the weight of it. One night, she woke to find his side of the bed empty. She found him in his office, surrounded by papers, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Talk to me, she said from the doorway. He looked up, seemed to debate with himself, then gestured for her to come in. There's a situation developing. Another family making moves into territory that's been stable for years. They're testing boundaries, seeing how far they can push. What are you going to do? What I always do. Show strength. Make it clear that pushing further will cost more than they're willing to pay. He rubbed his eyes. But I'm tired, Julia. Tired of the constant chess game, tired of having to prove myself over and over, tired of living like this. She moved behind him, started massaging the tension from his shoulders. Then stop. It's not that simple. Why not? You've said yourself that this life is killing you slowly. That you didn't choose it so much as inherit it. So choose something else. And do what? Walk away? That's not how this works. There's no retirement plan for people in my position. Then make one. You're smart enough, connected enough. Find a way out that doesn't end with you dead or in prison. He was quiet for a long time, her hands working the knots from his muscles. Finally, he said, if there was a way out that didn't destroy everything I've built and put everyone I care about at risk, would you come with me? Julia's breath caught. Where would we go? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere normal. Somewhere we could just be two people trying to figure out how to be happy. That sounds impossible. Probably is. She leaned down, wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested her chin on his shoulder. But if you could make it happen, yes. I'd come with you. He turned in the chair, pulled her into his lap, held her like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. I love you. More than I've ever loved anything. And that terrifies me. I know. Me too. They stayed like that, holding each other in the dim office, both knowing that the life they wanted and the life they had were on a collision course, and something would have to give. The crisis came 2 weeks later. Julia woke to gunfire. The sound was distant but unmistakable, sharp cracks that sent ice through her veins. She scrambled out of bed, grabbed her robe, ran for the door. It was locked from the outside. Panic clawed at her throat as she pounded on the wood. Let me out. What's happening? No answer. More gunfire. Shouting. The sound of running feet. She tried to control her breathing, tried to think. The window. She ran to it, looked out over the gardens. Men were moving in the darkness, tactical and purposeful. Not Gabrielle's men. The clothes were wrong, the movements too aggressive. The estate was under attack. Julia's hands shook as she looked around the room for something, anything she could use. Her phone was gone, removed from the room while she slept. She was trapped, helpless, and somewhere out there, Gabrielle was fighting for his life. Time became elastic, seconds stretching into hours. The gunfire intensified, then began to fade. The silence that followed was somehow worse. When the door finally opened, Julia nearly collapsed with relief. But it wasn't Gabrielle. It was Marcus, blood on his shirt, fear in his eyes. We have to go. Now. Where's Gabrielle? Alive, last I saw, but the estate's compromised. He told me to get you out. I'm not leaving without him. Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip almost painful. Jules, you don't understand. They're here for him, and if they find out you matter to him, they'll use you to make him surrender. The best thing you can do for him right now is not be here. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to stay, to find Gabrielle and make sure he was safe. But she saw the logic in Marcus's words, hated that it made sense. Where are we going? Safe house. Gabrielle has a dozen of them. We'll hide there until this is over. She let Marcus pull her through the halls, taking back routes she didn't know existed. They passed rooms that showed signs of struggle, but thankfully no bodies. Outside, a car was waiting, engine running, one of Gabrielle's trusted men behind the wheel. Julia got in, her heart in her throat, looking back at the estate as they pulled away. Somewhere in there, the man she loved was fighting a war, and she was running. It felt like abandonment, like cowardice, no matter how necessary it might be. The safe house was small, anonymous, in a neighborhood that looked working class and unremarkable. Marcus settled her in a back bedroom, promised to keep watch, left her with a phone that had one number programmed into it. She stared at it for 2 hours before it rang. Gabrielle's voice was rough, exhausted, but alive. Are you safe? Yes. Are you? For now. It's over. They've pulled back. What happened? Someone made a play. It didn't work. That's all you need to know right now. A pause. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. I'm sorry you had to run. I'm just glad you're alive. Her voice cracked on the words. When can I see you? Soon. I need to clean up the mess first, make sure there aren't more surprises waiting. But Julia, I need you to understand something. This is going to keep happening. Maybe not exactly like this, but there will always be threats, always be people who want what I have badly enough to kill for it. And as long as you're with me, you'll be in the crossfire. She closed her eyes, felt tears slip down her cheeks. Are you asking me to leave? I'm asking you to really think about what staying means. Because I love you too much to watch you get hurt because of me. Let me ask you something, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Do you want me to go? Silence on the other end, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, quietly, no. God help me, but no. Then I'm staying. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She heard him take a shaky breath. Okay. Okay. I'll send for you tomorrow. That night, Julia lay awake in the strange bed, listening to Marcus move around the safe house, and thought about the choice she'd just made. She'd chosen danger over safety. Uncertainty over stability. A man who lived with violence over a life of peace. But she'd also chosen love. Complicated, messy, imperfect love with someone who saw her, valued her, needed her as much as she needed him. When Gabrielle came for her the next day, he looked like he'd aged years overnight. There were shadows under his eyes, new tension in the set of his jaw. But when he saw her, something in his expression softened. She walked into his arms without hesitation, felt them close around her, solid and real. They stood like that in the doorway of the safe house, holding each other while Marcus politely found something else to do. I thought I might lose you, Gabrielle said against her hair. You didn't. You won't. You can't promise that. No. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere by choice. He pulled back enough to look at her, and she saw the war in his eyes. The part of him that wanted to believe this could work, warring with the part that knew better. I'm going to try to find a way out, he said. Not tomorrow, not next week, but I'm going to start building an exit strategy. Something that lets me step back without creating chaos. How long will that take? Years, probably. Maybe longer. And it might not even be possible. But I have to try, because the alternative is watching this life destroy us both. Julia took his face in her hands, made him focus on her. Then we'll take it one day at a time. We'll be careful, be smart, and we'll build towards something better. Together. Together, he echoed, like he was testing the word, seeing if it could hold the weight they were putting on it. They returned to the estate that afternoon. The damage had been repaired with impressive efficiency, all evidence of the attack erased. But Julia could feel the difference. The staff moved with heightened vigilance. Security was doubled. The sense of safety, already fragile, had been shattered completely. That night, as they lay in bed together, Gabrielle told her the truth he'd been holding back. The attack was personal. Someone who used to work for me, who I trusted, turned. They brought in outside muscle, tried to stage a coup. What happened to them? They failed. That's all that matters. Julia knew there was more to the story, details he was protecting her from. She chose not to push. Are we safe now? Safer. But truly safe? That's not something I can promise. She turned in his arms, looked at him in the dim light. I know. And I'm here anyway. He kissed her, slow and tender, and she felt the gratitude in it. The wonder that she'd stayed despite everything. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Probably not. I don't deserve to be caught up in this. But here we are, trying to make something good out of impossible circumstances. Time passed. Weeks became months. Julia's life took on a strange double nature. On one hand, she had purpose. She expanded her tutoring, started a small school for the estate workers' children. She maintained her relationship with Marcus, watching him grow into someone more responsible, more aware. She built friendships with some of the staff, found community in unexpected places. On the other hand, she lived with constant awareness of the precariousness of her situation. She knew that any day could bring another crisis. That the man she loved carried darkness she couldn't fully understand. That the future she wanted might always be just out of reach. But she also had moments of pure happiness. Quiet mornings with Gabrielle, drinking coffee in the garden. Evenings reading together in the library. The way he'd smile at her across a room, like she was the best thing he'd ever found. The knowledge that despite everything, they'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other. A year after she'd first arrived as a hostage, Julia stood in the garden where she'd first realized she was falling in love with Gabrielle. He found her there, as she'd known he would, and took her hand. "I've been working on the exit strategy," he said. "It's slow, but it's happening. I'm consolidating power, putting people in place who can take over pieces of the operation. Building legitimate businesses that can support us without the criminal element. It's going to take time, but I'm doing it." Julia leaned into him, hope blooming in her chest. "How much time?" 5 years, maybe. Possibly more. But I wanted you to know that I'm serious about this. About building a future where we're not constantly looking over our shoulders. Can I help?" He looked surprised. "You want to?" "I want to be part of the solution, not just someone you're trying to protect. If we're building towards something better, let me build it with you." So she did. She started working with the legitimate side of Gabrielle's businesses, helping with community outreach, educational programs, initiatives that put a respectable face on the Marino name. It was slow work, building trust where there'd been fear, but she was good at it. And gradually, things began to shift. The violence didn't disappear, but it became less frequent. Gabrielle delegated more, stepped back from the day-to-day dangers. He wasn't free, not by any means, but he was building the framework that might lead to freedom eventually. Julia knew that their story wouldn't have a fairy tale ending. There would always be complications, always be consequences for the life Gabrielle had lived. But they had something real, something worth fighting for, and that was enough. 2 years after she'd arrived, on a quiet evening in the library where they'd first kissed, Gabrielle got down on one knee. "I know I can't promise you safety," he said, holding out a ring that gleamed in the lamplight. "I can't promise you normal or easy or free from fear. But I can promise you that every day for the rest of my life, I will choose you. I will work toward being a better man than I was yesterday. I will build a future where we can be happy. And I will love you with everything I have. Will you marry me?" Julia looked at the ring, at the man offering it, at the impossible choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She thought about the girl she'd been when she first arrived, terrified and angry. She thought about everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. And she thought about the man who'd shown her that even in darkness, love could take root and grow. "Yes," she said, taking his hand and pulling him to his feet. "Yes, I'll marry you." They married quietly 6 months later, in a small ceremony with only Marcus and a handful of trusted friends present. No grand celebration, no public announcement. Just 2 people making promises they intended to keep, witnessed by those who understood what those promises cost. Julia became Julia Marino, and with the name came a strange kind of peace. She wasn't a hostage anymore, wasn't even really an outsider. She was family, with all the protection and danger that entailed. The years that followed weren't easy. There were setbacks in Gabrielle's exit strategy, moments when violence flared up despite his best efforts to avoid it. There were times when Julia questioned her choices, when the weight of the life they led felt crushing. But there were also moments of profound joy. Watching Gabrielle slowly become someone softer, someone who could imagine a future beyond survival. Building the school into something that truly mattered to the community. Finding her place in a world she'd never imagined being part of. And through it all, they had each other. Flawed, complicated, trying their best to be better than their circumstances demanded. It wasn't the life Julia had planned, wasn't the future she'd envisioned. But it was hers, chosen with open eyes and a full heart. 5 years after that first terrifying night, Gabrielle made his final move. He handed over control of the criminal operations to a carefully selected successor, maintaining only advisory role. He kept the legitimate businesses, built up over years of patient work, and stepped back from the life that had defined him for so long. It wasn't perfect freedom. He still carried connections, still had obligations, still lived with the consequences of decades of hard choices. But it was progress, real and hard won. Julia stood with him in the garden the day it became official, both of them older and wiser and marked by the journey they'd taken together. "Is it everything you hoped for?" she asked. Gabrielle pulled her close, rested his chin on top of her head. "No. But it's real, and it's ours, and that's better than hope." She smiled against his chest. You know what? You're absolutely right. They stood there as the sun set over the estate, two people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances and built something that looked almost like happiness. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't perfect. But it was theirs, forged in fire and chose with intention, and that made it more valuable than any fantasy could ever be. Hey loves, thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end of this story. I know this one was heavy. I know Julia and Gabrielle's journey wasn't easy to walk through. But I wanted to show you something real, you know? Something that didn't pretend love fixes everything, but that sometimes, in the middle of impossible situations, people find each other and choose to hold on. Julia didn't get a perfect ending. She got a complicated one, with scars and hard choices and a future that's still uncertain. But she got a man who truly sees her, who fights to be better for her, and she built a life that matters even in the darkest places. I'd really love to hear what you thought about this. Did Julia's choices make sense to you? Do you think Gabrielle deserved her forgiveness? What would you have done in her position? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what made you emotional, what surprised you, what you connected with. I read every single one, and your words mean the world to me. And if this story touched you, please share it with someone who loves intense, emotional romance. It helps me keep creating these stories for you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, even in the hardest moments, the choices we make with our whole hearts are the ones that define us.